The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Yeah, sure thing.
Hey, you saw that car yet?
Yeah, sold it to Carvana.
Oh, I thought you were selling to that guy.
The guy who wanted to pay me in foreign currency, no interest, over 36 months? Yeah, no. Carvana gave me an offer in minutes, picked it up, and paid me on the spot. It was so convenient.
Just like that.
Yeah?
No hassle.
None.
That is super convenient.
Sell your car to Carvana and swap hassle for convenience. Pickup fees may apply.
Amateur Traveler, episode 929. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about castles and cassoulet, jousting and wine, Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade, as we go to the Languedoc region of southern France. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about the Languedoc. I'd like to welcome to the show Craig from Dallas, who's come to talk to us about an itinerary in southern France. Craig, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate being on, and hopefully this will be fun to talk travel.
Excellent. What's the itinerary that you are going to present to us, first of all?
The region that we're going to be talking about is the Languedoc Region area of France, which is an area in southern France. It also is called the Occitanie region, just from some of the history of that region. But I'll probably refer to it mostly as just this region of southern France. And so I think people that might be thinking about coming to this area, this may not be the first time that you would come to France and go to this area. You're probably going to places like Paris and Normandy and Bordeaux and all the usual places in France. But my wife and I have been trying to work our way through exploring France region by region over the years, and what we've been trying to do is spend more time in a smaller region versus a lot of different places in a lot of different regions. And so if you're trying to do that in France in particular, I think this is a really specific and unique region to try to go to, because it does have some regional differences that make it interesting, say, from other parts of France. That's why I would recommend going to this area in general. In terms of some of the specifics of this area, before we dive into some of the things to do, we went during late October, early November. So I think that time of year was a very nice time to go. We did that on purpose because we were trying to find areas to go to that are maybe a little off prime tourist season, but not so much that the weather would be terrible or that there would be nothing going on. And so I think this time of the year in this part of France, the weather was just absolutely spectacular. It was very nice and warm, not too cold, but not too hot. I suspect probably this area in prime summer would get pretty hot, but that's probably true of a lot of places that you go to. But we thought this was a very nice place to go to weather-wise. I suspect probably early spring would be another beautiful time to come here. So if you're trying to plan around for weather and you're trying to think of something to do late fall, this is a very nice place to go to in France. Again, some of the general things I might say about this region as why one might want to go to this place and explore it. You're going to find a lot of the same things here that you would think of going to France in general. Very good food and wine, churches, castles, palaces, art museums. So all the normal favorites that people might have to go to France, or maybe if they haven't been and they wanted to experience some of those things, I think you get all of those things in this region. But one of the other nice things about it in general is it's not really very heavily a touristed area. At least it was one of the regions of France that we had not been to before because we've been hitting all the normal usual suspects. So
Mhm.
we did not run across huge tourist groups, hundreds of people walking behind someone with a flag as they were walking around explaining things to them. Even in some of the places that were obviously tourist places that people were going to, you just never really felt that there was a lot of crowds or tourists there. Again, maybe that might be different other times of the year, but there certainly were many people out and about, and I suspect a fair number of them were just like us. They were probably tourists too, but it didn't really feel touristed, if that makes sense, with crowds and people in lines. And we never had a restaurant that we really felt like we needed to go make reservations to, because more or less you just walked in. Same thing with sites. It was very easy to get in. So I think that would be a reason to maybe think about this area, in addition to weather, lack of crowds. But this region, there are, I think, some things that make it unique and different. And so we talked about some of the food and wine things that are applicable to France in general. But it's interesting because in this area, there's a fair amount of Spanish influences on the foods. And so that was an interesting
Right.
surprise to run across, where you would see all of the normal French foods that you would expect, French wines. But then it was interesting because you would see signs for tapas and paella and things that you would associate with maybe being in Spain. And it was fun because not only was it something that was open at 6 o'clock maybe or 5 o'clock if you were hungry, which sometimes that can be a challenge in, say, France, where just nothing is open until later and they've got very specific lunch hours and dinner hours. And sometimes it's a challenge if you miss that or you forget what those times are, that you might be walking around hungry. And so it was nice to be in an area where you had the tapas culture of late afternoon happy
Uh-huh.
hour with food and drinks and some pretty substantial things to eat. And it wasn't just French food, which was also nice and wonderful and fun to see that in a tapas setting. But it was also fun to see some Spanish favorites that we ran across as well. And then the wines are excellent there as well. They have very good red wines in that region, very good white wines in that region.
Let me actually insert here. And if this sounds familiar to some people, we have talked about the Languedoc before on Amateur Traveler. We talked about it a long time ago in episode 244, Montpellier and the Languedoc region of France, and in the travel to Toulouse, which we're also going to talk about in this
Hmm.
episode, way back in episode 367. And then most recently, when I sailed on the Canal de Midi in the Languedoc in episode 655.
Right.
So if it sounds familiar, that's why, or you've heard about it from other places, but it seemed like it was worth revisiting this destination. So I think you've already anticipated, Craig, several of my questions. So we'll skip over the why because you gave us that. In terms of what particular itinerary you're going to
Hmm.
recommend for us.
So the itinerary that I came up with was a week, so 7 days on the ground, and I'll go through those day by day. My
Mhm.
general advice would be that if you have more time than that, certainly there are a lot of things that you can do on the front end or the back end, or you could do what we did, which is just take that same trip and just slow down a bit. And we had roughly about 2 weeks to do the same trip, but I've condensed it to the best of the highlights of the first 7 days. So I think the way we did it, and that would be the way that I would recommend to people, is we started in Montpellier, so that's fairly easy to fly into. I think you can find lots
Mhm.
of connections from the United States to get there, so that was pretty straightforward to get there. It's the seventh largest city in France. That was a surprise to me to know that it was fairly substantial. So there's all the things that come along with being a bigger city, but they've got a very beautiful historic core and center, and that's where we stayed the whole time. And in general, we got around by Uber, except when we rented a car. But when we're staying in the historic core of some of the cities like Montpellier, it was very easy to just get around in Uber. So starting in Montpellier, as we usually do on a lot of our trips, if we can find it, we love to start off with a group walking tour, one of the tipped based
Mhm.
group walking tours. There usually are quite a few to choose from. In Montpellier, I think there were maybe one or two. And so we found one that was very nice, and that's always a good way to walk around, get a feel of the city, and get a layout so that you don't get too lost later on.
And were you finding that walking tour through the tourism office or through the internet?
Internet usually. Usually, a lot of times I just will type in city, fill in the blank, free walking tour, and
Sure.
usually you get some pretty good hits that way. And sometimes that's the best choice, and sometimes with more digging, you can find some others, or if you look on TripAdvisor or something else, you can find some. And I'll mention somebody that we found different than that later on. But for Montpellier, we just did a group walking tour that I think I sent you the info that you could put in the show notes. I would recommend them. They were the very classic, very fun walking tour where not only do you get to see some of the big highlights of the city itself, but there's just somebody there pointing out a lot of little strange things that are actually interesting and funny that you never would find
Right.
yourself, or if you tried, you'd spend all day trying to find this little spot on the pavement that they know exactly where it is, and they point to it and they tell you the story, and it could be up on the wall or it could be behind a bush, but it's always funny and interesting. And I find a lot of times that you remember those stories more than, here's this church and here was a pope that was there, but sometimes the little
Right.
funny small stories are some of the interesting ones. So Montpellier is a big university city, and so
Hmm.
there's a lot of vibrant cafes and restaurants, and but it also has a lot of street art. And by street art, that's not just graffiti painted everywhere. It's actually big murals that they will paint on buildings. Sometimes it's very interesting because it makes it look like some historic scene that is on the side of a building with famous
Mm.
people from that place doing something interesting. But sometimes it's just a big cat or some other very interesting thing that somebody's painted on the side of a building. And you might not notice all of those if you were just walking around, but it's always fun to have a guy that points out that kind of stuff to you at the same time. And they give you just a good general orientation. And Montpellier, the historical area, is not that big of an area. You really can't get lost in a group walking tour. A few of the highlights that I would mention there, it's got its own variation of an Arc de Triomphe, their version of an
Okay.
arc that is very beautiful and pretty. And then right through the middle of where that arc is, there's a path that cuts through the old city. And one of the interesting things about this trip that I'll probably mention a couple of times is if you're a fan of the Camino de Santiago, which I am, and that's
Hmm.
the pilgrimage path that people would recognize as going from the Pyrenees in France over into Spain and then going all the way across Spain. But historically, there's a lot of those paths that all connect
Right.
eventually to Santiago de Compostela. And one of the old traditional paths that people would go through, if you just imagine it on a map, you'd say anyone that's coming from this region has to go some direction. And what would that direction have been, or what would that path have been? And the primary path through this area they call the Arles Way because it originates in Arles, but it also is called the Via Tolosana, which is just a way of saying Toulouse. And so there's a couple of different names that this Camino goes by, and it's for sure not a very popular one. There's not a lot of people going on it, but it goes right through Toulouse and it goes through some of the countryside, which I'll mention some of those stops as we go through the trip. And it ends up going through Toulouse as well. And in all those cities, it's fun to go along and notice the Camino shells or some of the other markers that are marking that path. And so they pointed
Mm.
out some of that in the walking tour as well. A couple of the other highlights just in Montpellier in general, there's a faculty of medicine, which apparently is the oldest one in Europe. I think there's probably a lot of oldest faculty of medicines in Europe, but this is one of them. I don't know if it really is the oldest one, but it's an actual still practicing university town, as I mentioned, but they've got medical training there. And so the old medical facility that they had is still in use. And then there's a big, huge cathedral like there are in a lot of these places, but in this particular place in Montpellier, the Saint Pierre Cathedral, it's a massive Gothic looking church that somewhat looks like a church, but it somewhat looks like a fortress. And we'll get into some of the reasons why that kind of architecture is in this region. And it goes back to the 1300s. And I think it once had the coat of arms of Pope Urban V, who is a student and teacher in Montpellier and then got to be Pope. So it's got a lot of that backstory of large cathedrals that were occupied by some very prominent, important person, at least in some point in history. And it's still an active place to go and have people go to church there as well.
Okay.
One other thing I would probably mention about Montpellier, again, I think I talked about at the beginning that you're going to see plenty of art and museums. In Montpellier, there's a museum called the Museum Fabre, which is apparently the second largest French art collection second to the Louvre in all of France. So that's an interesting thing to go see. So we went, paid a visit to that museum. It's got obviously art that you could spend a whole day or more looking at. 15th through 19th century artwork, beautiful, just a ton of artwork there, and it's right there, right in the middle of the historic center. I think it was about a 5 or 6 minute walk from our hotel. So there's a lot to see and do in that town because it's a university town. It really feels very vibrant with many people out at cafes and bars and restaurants and shops full of all kinds of things that you might want to look at. But it also felt very cool and hip with more of a university vibe versus sometimes you go to a city and it's got very beautiful things, but it all feels like it's been there for a long time and nobody's really updated it very recently. But there were just shops full of people and coffee and bars and restaurants and tapas places. So it was a very interesting place to get that energy and the vibe from it.
Excellent. You mentioned that the art museum was the second largest in France, and we just had an episode on Lyon where we said the art museum was the second largest in
I know.
France.
Yeah, yeah.
The internet thinks that Lyon is. So
yeah,
yes,
it's like I've seen the oldest university in Europe or something, and I'm sure if the
right,
internet
right.
would tell you that might be a different issue as well. But they're both worth seeing because they're both very interesting, whether they're the oldest or the biggest or whatever it is. But
And part of the problem there comes from one is measuring potentially by square foot and the other one's measuring by pieces of art, or you
Yeah.
never know quite. But I found that when the tourism boards tell me these things, I don't always believe them.
yeah. A couple of the other unique things that somebody might want to go to Montpellier to see, and I'm sure no one would come just because of this, but it's the kind of things like we talked about, the little oddball things that you remember.
Right.
Apparently, Nostradamus was a student at this university here, at least for some period of time. And while he was
All
here,
right.
I guess he was working on his prophecies and other things. And so apparently he made some prediction here about some tree on some old tower, and which is a tower that's got some tree growing on top of it. And I'm sure it's not the tree that's always been there, but he made some prophecy that said if this tree ever died and ceased to exist, then the city would go away and would fall. And again, I'm sure that that's like a lot of Nostradamus prophecies. You can read into it what you will, but they have the tree there. It's still alive. I think they feel obligated to water it and keep it alive, just maybe for tourism purposes or maybe for prophecy purposes. But there's a lot of those kind of little oddball things that you just run across and think, oh, okay, well, I would not have known that, except the guide would point out those kind of interesting tidbits for you as you go along.
Yep.
The other thing that I think a lot of people would enjoy in Montpellier before we move on from that city is it's really got some interesting, beautiful architecture and side streets. And apparently there's a lot of people on Instagram that love to take pictures of all the little shops and side streets because they really are photogenic. If going to a place and taking photographs would be your thing, I think this would be a really good place to do some of that. So that's the full day in Montpellier. We actually stay there
Okay.
a second day, but we used the second day to essentially go on a wine tour. So we had a local person. I think I've given you the info that we found on Airbnb Experiences. So Bernard was awesome. He was just a guy that was very familiar with the area, picked us up in the city, and then we just proceeded to drive around the countryside. And so we learned a lot about this particular area of France. The regional wine area is the Pic Saint Loup, Loup area, which I did not know that was a specific, almost like an AVA that we would think of as in the U.S. And so it's got very regional white wines, red wines, a lot of fun. We love doing that when we go on a trip because someone will just take you, drive you around, point you to all the little unique things that there are to see, the mountains and the streams, and you can see what the countryside looks like. And then they take you, normally, at least on this one, to some very small vineyards, and the owners that are right there, it's just us, it's just them. So you've got the owner who's very passionate about his farm and his vineyard and is letting you try all of his wines, and there's a story behind all of them. And we just always really enjoy that a lot because you can not only enjoy some really good wines, but it's also a way to see what people are doing locally and see how they've been running these vineyards forever. And the interesting things about at least the two vineyards that we went through is that both of these very small vineyards, both were super proud of their Roman history that they had. So one guy had found
interesting
pottery and coins and all kinds of things over the years working on his vineyard. And so he, of course, had a little display case that had all of this stuff, which is neat to think that you were working your vineyard and found a Roman coin. I'm sure that doesn't happen every day, but that probably was an interesting thing. And then the second small vineyard we went to, they had actually uncovered a small portion of a Roman road that ran right through their vineyard, and they had uncovered it, and you could see the cobblestones, and it might have gone for 50 feet, but just imagining that there was some, probably not a primary Roman road. The Romans built things to last, so it was interesting to think
Right.
about that area and Roman roads running through there and just all the history. So it was fun to go around and just see the countryside and see what the region looked like. And one of the things that we stopped at, because I mentioned the Camino de Santiago a bit ago, there's a part of that particular Camino path. There's a famous UNESCO abbey that is out in that countryside that you would have to make a special occasion to go see. It's in a very small, secluded valley that's called the Abbey Galone. And there's a very small abbey, a very small church, a very beautiful town tucked away in this very small valley. You kind of imagine, as you're going back to it, the Cathar days, which we'll talk about the Cathars here in a minute. But you can imagine yourself of you're traversing this valley, going up into this dead end space and thinking, yeah, back in the day, that's where they were trying to isolate themselves so they wouldn't get invaded by some of the other places. And it's still a stop on that Camino. And funny enough, the day that we were there, and that was in early November, so not really what you would think of as the primary time people would be walking the Camino. There was a lady there, a mom with 5 young teenage boys that all had their walking sticks and their Camino shells and their backpacks and their ponchos on, and they were in there getting their Camino stamp. And so I talked to them for a bit in part English and part French, but it was fun. It was just fun to imagine that not only is this a historic place that people have been doing that for a long time, but today they're still doing it. So it was fun, at least for people that like the Camino or the idea of hiking, to see that. But I would recommend, if you're in this area from some town, I think Montpellier is a logical place to do it from, is to try to get out one day and just go see the countryside, go visit some wineries, go hike up some of the hills, because it's a beautiful area, and a lot of the stuff to see is in the towns and the cities, but it's really beautiful in the countryside too.
Ah bon chien. Bonjour, je suis Theo, a tour leader with Explore, and this is Punti. He's helping us find truffles under the trees next to this beautiful vineyard. Maybe for tomorrow's cooking class? Oui, c'est mieux heure. Parfait. C'est mieux o'clock. Not everyone gets to enjoy a Bordeaux sunset this way, but you will. If you explore. No, Punti. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel. Explore.
Well, and before we get too far away from wines, for those people who are wine lovers, the French wines in the Languedoc are a little different, especially the red wines. If you go to Burgundy, for instance, you're predominantly known for, or it's predominantly known for its single variety wines.
Yeah.
And yet most of the red wines of the Languedoc are blends.
Right.
And I like them, but they're a little less known because of that. So they tend to use Grenache, Syrah, Moudèvre, and also in a couple lesser known grapes, the Carignan, and I don't know how to pronounce Carignan, and the Cinsault grapes. So
you're exactly right about that. And my wife and I, we enjoy wine too, and at least try to have a slight bit of knowledge about that and try to go out and explore that too. But you're right. It's a very interesting, because it's not, you're just going to Champagne, so you're just going to have Champagne, or you're going to go to Burgundy and you're going to drink Burgundy wines, and it's a single varietal. There's a whole bunch of names on a whole bunch of different wines, none of which we really recognize, but they were all very good and delicious. And as you said, blends of different things. And apparently this area, so we got to learn a little bit more of that on our day tour. This area at one time was just a bulk wine producing area. So they just produced a lot of bulk wine to go send it to somebody else to maybe blend it with something else and put their label on it. And so it wasn't for a long time known as a fine wine region. But apparently, and it seemed to be the case from some of the places that we went to, they're trying to change that, where that people really appreciate it being a Languedoc wine specifically, and trying to have a little more recognition for those areas. And the Pic Saint Loup is apparently one of those labels that they're trying to have more well known and market it as that, versus just a no-name red wine. And I think, again, assuming the internet is right about this, it's still one of the largest producing wine areas in the world in terms of just volume for a specific area. So there's a lot of wine that's produced here. And not only is there a lot, what we have at least for some of these vineyards and chateaus, is really good. So that was our experience there. So if you like wine,
Yeah,
it's a great place.
yeah, I'm reading that it produces more than a third of France's total
Hmm.
wine, and in 2001, it produced more wine than the United States.
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't have any
All
idea that
places.
there was that much coming from there. But as you might expect, the French have been making wine for a long time, and I
A little
thought it
bit,
was
yeah.
very good here too. Whether you've not heard of these wines before, or maybe you have, I think it was a lot of fun just to go out and try things that you didn't really recognize, and they were not very expensive, and the winemaker was very proud of it, and we always enjoy doing that. And this was a great place to go do that, I think.
Sounds good.
So the next place that we went to is so then we picked up our car. So we had been in the city without a car, and now we were going to try to tour the countryside. And so the next place I would recommend people go to is Sete. So that's Sete, but it's pronounced Sete, and that's essentially on the coast. And it's not very far from Montpellier. It's a very easy drive to get there. We took a drive up to, there's a panoramic view first over the city, which I thought was fun to go up to because you could look out, orient yourself, see that you're on the Mediterranean, but you're also on an area that's got this big lagoon. The Canal de Midi is coming right out there, so that's the place where that canal that was built so long ago, that's its outlet to the
Hmm.
Mediterranean. So it's interesting because you can see it, you can see where it comes out, you can see where it's coming into the city, and in this big lagoon, you can see just acres and acres of the oyster farms that are out there where they've got all the oysters being farmed. So it was fun to go up there to start and get an idea about what you knew you were about to see once you went into the town. So I'd recommend if you're getting a rental car, drive up to the top of that hill, look at everything. It's very easy, and then drive into the town itself. It's not a very big town. They call it the Little Venice of France because of all the canals. I think that's probably a little bit of a overstatement, but it does have very pretty canals and bridges. I don't think it really holds up to Venice, but it's still very pretty. And all along the canals in the city part, they're just lined with shops and restaurants. We went to the food market because in almost every place that you go to in these towns in France, the food market is always a fun thing to go to because you can see a bunch of things that you wouldn't expect there to be there, but then you can see what it is that they like to eat there a lot. And that's where we wanted to try, and I'm not going to pronounce it probably very well, but it's the Tiel Satois, which is a savory hand pie that they make there that have chunks of octopus and a spicy red tomato sauce. So that's their unique street food there.
Okay.
And it was very good. It was a unique. I'd never had octopus in a essentially like an empanada, but it was very good. As a mid-morning snack, everyone was out having that, and then of course by lunch, all the locals were out next to this food market with huge plates of raw oysters and wine and prawns, and they serve them in these big 2 foot wide plates, iced down with oysters and prawns everywhere. And so that is obviously the food of choice in that area since you're so close to the ocean, and that was fun to do. And then you can just stroll along the canals and the bridges and check out the place. It's not very big, but it's very pretty. And the interesting thing they do in this particular place is apparently we weren't there in the summer when they do this, but during the summers in these canals, the local men will get together in teams of rowing boats essentially, and maybe you've got
Right.
10 people or something, and they joust. So they have a guy on the front with a pole, and they have a guy on the other boat with a pole, and they go right at each other, and you're supposed to knock the other guy off, and whoever knocks the other guy off, then that team wins. And I'm sure they have the honors for a whole year, and probably get free oysters and drinks for a year, whoever team wins. So but there were a lot of big statues that showed a boat with a guy with a long pole on it, and I wouldn't have really known that's what that was, except I'd done some of the research and watched some of the videos, and it's interesting. It's an interesting local custom they have there.
Yeah, in the old show that we have on Montpellier and the Languedoc, there's a little more description from our guest who had watched the jousting, as I recall in
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
One comment about the Canal de Midi, which you mentioned. So that is another UNESCO World Heritage Site. And again, we've got a whole separate episode about cruising the Canal de Midi, but it was built in the 1600s. So it was over 100 years old when Thomas Jefferson visited it, for instance. And this really predates the railroads as a major way to move goods and products around France or the canal system.
It's amazing to look at it, and we passed it several times on the road trip from the first to the end. So you cross over it several times, and it is
Yep.
mind-boggling to imagine back then, as long ago as they did that, digging a trench that far.
And it's not just a trench, too, because at times it is higher than the local surroundings. So
the other thing I would recommend that anyone do if you're in Sete, for sure, it has to rank as one of our most unique dining experiences as we've traveled over the years. They have oyster shacks, and there are several of them that are really famous, and you have to get a reservation online to get into them, although I think the time of the year we went, you probably didn't have to do that, but certainly in the summer you would have to do this. But you're essentially going out to what seems like a shack on the water that's looking out with a little pier over the water, and it's a very nice looking dining experience, but it feels like you're in a metal shack, and they're just bringing in the fresh oysters right off of their oyster shacks. And the thing to do there, which we did, so we ordered one of those 2-foot wide plates full of ice with raw oysters, a bowl of cooked mussels, their local white wine. It was delicious. And I'm not even an oyster fan. I don't really like oysters, but there you just had to do it because it was such a unique thing to do. The view is beautiful. You're looking back over the water at the town. The guys are coming back and forth, just bringing in fresh oysters all day long to ship to wherever, and they're just diverting a plateful at a time to anybody that shows up and wants to buy it. I can't imagine a more unique way of having fresh raw oysters than doing something like that with the local wine. So I would strongly recommend anybody do that because that was a lot of fun.
Excellent.
So from there, again, we just stopped and Sete for the day, and there's beaches and there's a lot of other things that you could do if you wanted to extend that. And the beaches there were beautiful, but we just popped out to one, looked at it, and then got back on the road because we had to make it that night, if you're following this schedule, to Beziers. So that's the next town in line to go see. We had spent most of our time that day in Sete, and so when we got to Beziers, we stopped at, this is one of the only restaurants I'll mention on the list because if you Google this area, it comes up all the time, and there's a restaurant called Pika Pika, which is essentially a Michelin-starred restaurant, but it's not overly expensive, and their whole menu is a tapas style menu there as well, which is very interesting tapas. And usually if you see a restaurant on the internet, sometimes that means you probably don't want to go there because too many people have gone there and there's too much written about it and it won't live up to its expectation. But that one was a really good restaurant to go to. Again, it was Michelin starred. Everything was presented in a very interesting way. It's right there on the main square in Beziers that they've recently redeveloped and obviously spent a lot of money here in the last few years. Probably your prior podcast, I suspect, probably had a different view of Beziers because apparently in the last few years they've really spent a lot of money trying to make it nice and pretty and spent a lot of money redeveloping it. And so a few of the people that we ran across, they come to Beziers every year because they've really enjoyed coming there over the last couple of years.
Mm.
So in our itinerary, we had essentially one day in Beziers because we got there in the evening, checked in, and so we had a full evening to see Beziers. Again, it's a little bit like Sete. It's not going to take you that long to see it. There's a historic core that's really beautiful there. There's Italian style architecture, there's French style architecture, there's Romanesque architecture. It's got a lot of different historical stuff going on there. A couple of the most interesting things that I'd mention about Beziers, because at least if you're like me, you had not heard that name before, but some stories about it people had heard. So, for instance, most people probably think of the Cathar massacre that occurred back in the day when essentially the King of France and the Pope decided, both of them, it was in their best interest to take over this area and control the land and also control the religion. And between the two of them, that was a good chance to come in and essentially massacre the Cathars. Most people have probably heard in some form or fashion the statement that says, kill them all and God will recognize his own. This is the place where that came from. So there was a massacre in this town by one of the people that was in charge of all of that battle. And when one of his soldiers asked him, if we go in and kill everybody, why are we supposed to do that? And that was his reply, that kill everybody and God will recognize it and sort it out, which was a sad statement, but a very interesting thing to think about. That's where this came from.
This was the Albigensian Crusade.
Yes.
Not all the Crusades headed to the Middle East.
Yeah, it was interesting to see a lot of evidence of that all through this whole region. You could see the ramifications of that both in terms of these huge churches that looked almost like fortresses that came after that, where you could imagine the king and the Pope sort of building these as a statement, we're in charge now, so don't mess with us again for whoever's left. And then you could see it also in a lot of castle ruins in the countryside that you could go see as well. But it was an interesting thing to look at here that you wouldn't find in other parts of France. But again, in the town itself, really beautiful buildings, churches. Again, parts of the Camino go through here, old bridges that you can walk across, taking a ton of pictures. It's also fun because in Beziers you can see evidence of Roman ruins right in the middle of the old town. There's an old Roman amphitheater that they've preserved, and it makes you remember that's where a lot of this probably started, from being a Roman road and a Roman settlement, and then everything has just been built on that layer upon layer. But also there's a fun reminder in Beziers of what we talked about before. The Spanish flair is there's a building that's a bull ring. So it's a big building, it's round. We didn't go inside of it because they weren't having any bullfights now. Apparently here they don't actually kill the bull, they just fight with it. But it's interesting because that is being a Spanish thing.
I think you try and basically dance around it and see if you can get close to the bull and touch the
Right,
bull, if I remember
right,
correctly,
right.
the Southern French version.
Yeah.
You're in there with no cape and no sword. But and actually you say it started with the Romans. This was actually an ancient Greek colony. Even before that, it dates back to 575 BC, older than most of the Roman ruins.
Yeah, and that's like Montpellier and Toulouse, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's just layer upon layer of different civilizations and some way to see some evidence of all those, all the way back from the Romans to present day. So it's really, if you like architecture, if you like thinking about how things evolved over history and watching the buildings change as a result of that, it's a very interesting place to see. So that's the day in Beziers. We essentially just had a day to wander and get lost and look at very pretty things. And then after that, the next stop, when we left back to the Cathar ruins, on this road trip with a slight detour, you can get to a place called Las Tours, which is essentially some old Cathar ruins on mountains. And you can hike up to those ruins if you want to, if you have a longer time to do it. We just went to essentially the observation point that you could see it, but you got relatively close to where it was. It was beautiful views. There was nobody there. For a couple of euros, you go into the parking lot and just some amazing epic ruins looking out over these ruined Cathar castles, which there's still enough of them standing where you can completely visualize what that probably looked like. But they're lonely towers that are on this lonely hill in this secluded valley. And there are many of those in this region. This one just happened to be
Mhm.
the one that we could easily get to. But there's apparently 3 or 4 even more impressive areas if you're willing to go a little bit further off the beaten path. But I think if you're in this region, just seeing one of those is very evocative, just being there alone on the top of a hill looking out over some of these ruined castles. And we really enjoyed seeing that.
Excellent.
And so then on the way, while again we were on a road trip, we stopped at a chateau, did another wine tasting. There are many of those to do there as well, but you've got to stop and have lunch somewhere, so you might as well do what the French do, which is find a local chateau that has a food and wine pairing. And as far as we could tell, we were the only ones there that were tourists. Everybody else was just doing their normal weekday lunch, business as usual in France, where everybody's enjoying good food and good wine on a long lunch. But there's many places that you can stop in that area to do that. But we had to move on because our goal that day was to get to Carcassonne and to get there roughly by about 4 o'clock. And we were trying to get there on purpose because we were following at least some good guidebook advice that said you really want to get there as the tourists are leaving and then be there for the evening
Got it.
after they're gone.
Mhm.
And that was excellent advice because we got there about 4 o'clock. Carcassonne is an amazing medieval fortress city. It's one of those where you've seen pictures of it and you wonder, is it going to really be as impressive when you're there as it
Yeah,
seems?
yeah.
And it is. And it's been restored completely. I'm sure some of the restoration probably used their imagination, but I can't really imagine a place that we've been that if you were trying to envision what is a medieval fortress with towers and ramparts and drawbridges and moats and arrow slits and all the things that go along with whatever you envision, it's all there, all reconstructed. So it's a really impressive sight to see. And the advice that we took, which I would give to anybody else, is try to be there at the end of the day when people are leaving, especially I'm sure in the summers it's got to be an absolute zoo. But when all the tourists and the tour buses are leaving, then you almost have the place to yourself and stay there for a night, which is what we did. Try to get one of the hotels that you can stay in that let you stay inside the city. There's two of those. There's a really expensive one,
Hmm.
and then there's the Best Western Donjon Hotel. And we chose the latter because we were literally just going to stay there for the evening, and it's not bad price at all. And you get to be right in the middle of the city. You don't have to go back and forth to your car parking lot. It makes it very easy to get there. And one of the things that is different in Carcassonne this year is they just finished the rampart renovation. So apparently this is the first time, just this fall is when they open it back up. This is the first time in hundreds of years that you can walk the entirety of all of the ramparts all the way around the city, because now you
Oh,
can do that
interesting.
and you could not do that before. So maybe your
Right.
prior podcast that you guys did, you were just walking sections of it. And this part is just dumb luck, but maybe some good planning. But we came in at the end of the day, went directly to the ramparts because we knew that's what you needed to do because they closed. And we literally were the last ones there. And the lady was coming behind us as we went through each tower and said, "Take your time, there's no rush." But as we were walking along it, she was shutting the doors all the way around. So literally everybody had cleaned out on the ramparts, and we just took our time walking all the way around, and you felt like you had it yourself. But that's probably hard to replicate. But for sure, the rampart walk is really beautiful.
And this is you mentioned it was a walled town. It's actually a double walled town. And if you look closely, I can't remember if it's the inner or the outer wall. Look at the lower traces of the wall and you'll see red brick. And that's the Roman part of the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, this was a Roman city long before it was a medieval city. And they reused some parts of the wall or built it up higher than the Romans had it, but a very ancient city.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's completely impressive to imagine building it or to try to take it or to try to conquer it. All of those things seem extremely daunting, which I'm sure is exactly what it was intended to be. But really, you don't need more than we came in the afternoon, as I said. Once you walk the ramparts, there's a couple of other sites that you can see. It's basically just wandering around the city at night. It's beautiful when it's all lit up and dark and there's almost no one there. It really feels so different. It feels a lot like Mont Saint Michel, which we did the same thing years ago when we were there. Is go there at the end of the day, the tourists leave, you've got the place to yourself, and then get up the next morning before everybody gets there and then leave. That's all the time you really need to see it, but it's so much more pretty to see when there's hardly anybody there and it's lit up at night and it seems spooky and imposing. We really had a good time. I would encourage anybody to go see Carcassonne because it's really fun. And if you're in Carcassonne, then of course you have to try one of the regional dishes here, which is their version of cassoulet. And cassoulet is a baked dish that's got a lot of different kinds of meat. It always has pork, I believe. It always has sausage in it. It always has large brown beans in it. And then some places we had it that had chicken. Some places had it duck. Some places there may have been both, and we didn't even know the difference. But it's a very hearty, filling dish. And this is one of the iconic places to go have it. So if you're in that region, I would definitely advise trying to have that dish at some place because it's very interesting, very good, and you definitely won't be hungry after you have it.
Okay.
So then we got up the next morning and then we started driving towards Toulouse. So here, I guess my advice to folks would be if you really only have a couple of days left in your itinerary, then probably go straight to Toulouse because there's lots and lots to see from Toulouse. But if you have a little more time, and this is what we did as well, while you're on the road anyway, if you take a slight detour and you go to Albi, which, as you mentioned a bit ago, the Albigensian Crusades, that's where that name
Right.
came from because the people were there from Albi. And there's not a lot to see in Albi, and you can see it relatively quickly, but the cathedral there is absolutely amazing and spectacular. It's enormous. It is so imposing, and definitely if that was the home of where the rebellion was coming, let's say, that's the place where the church and the king decided to put the biggest cathedral to say, you guys watch this and pay attention if anybody thinks about doing that again. So it looks like a fortress, but it's the inside of it is absolutely spectacular. It's got a ceiling that reminds you of the Sistine Chapel in the sense of how it's painted and the vibrant colors that are there. And it's apparently never been renovated or touched in 500 years, so it hasn't been redone. That's really what it has looked like the whole time. And then on the back side of the church, it's got I believe it's the largest Italian Renaissance painting that is in France in terms of size. It's a huge fresco of Judgment Day, and like all Judgment Day pictures, it's got all of the artist's imagining of all the ways the devil could do bad things to you when you're in hell. And if you have a really big area to work with, you can use your imagination as to how many different ways people could be tortured for all the bad things apparently that they did in life. And those are the more interesting side. That then you've got the side where everybody that's good is going to heaven. But the more interesting side is always seeing all the bad things that are going to happen to you if you do bad things. But it's absolutely spectacular inside. It's definitely worth seeing if you've got the time. And then depending on your interest level, in Albi is also the Toulouse-Lautrec Museum for the
Oh,
artist
okay.
Henry de Toulouse-Lautrec, which I was not that familiar with him and his art, but like we were talking about before about some of the sayings that you know the saying, but you didn't really know where it came from. Everybody has seen pictures that this artist did or of that style
Sure.
because it's very much the Moulin Rouge posters and advertisements of that
Right.
time in France. And so you're used to seeing those posters or some stylized version of those posters, but he's the guy that created all of that kind of an art. And he did a lot of other kind of art as well, but that's what he's most famous for. And we happened to just be there at the wrong time and couldn't do both the cathedral and the art museum. But if you were interested in that kind of an art, that's where all of his works are there. So that would definitely be something we're doing if you are into that kind of an art. If you're not got the time and you want to skip all of that, then as I said, you just go straight from Carcassonne to Toulouse, which would be our last stop on our list.
Got it. Okay.
Toulouse is known as the Rose City because of the color of all its brick buildings. It's got that classic red looking brick everywhere, and it's a huge city, and it's got so many huge buildings, and it's very interesting because there are so many buildings that are enormous and they're almost all in brick. So that's a very interesting looking city, and that's how it got its name because apparently the bricks in the sunlight or the sunset look very rose colored. It's the fourth largest city in France, so it's very easy to get in and out of. That we picked it as the end of our trip because it was relatively easy to get there back to the US because it's a fairly major city. If you're going to be staying in Toulouse for more than a couple of days, I would say they have a very good city card that you can buy that essentially you pay a one-time fee and then you get access to transportation and a lot of museums and things to see because if you're staying there for a while like we were, there is a lot to see there and it's definitely worth it. A few of the things that we did in particular that were just really fun more than it was historic, they've got a food market which there is called the Victor Hugo Market. So it's tons of people there, tons of food. We had a food walking tour that we did there that did it in a very fun way where you went through the market and you picked various specialty goods that are unique to Toulouse, like Toulouse sausages, and they have candied violets is one of the foods that is one of their
Oh,
special desserts. That
okay.
they actually take violets and they candy them, and it tastes
Huh.
what you would think like you. It's like chewing on a violet that's candied and sugar, and it was good, but it was a surprising taste. But excellent cheeses, excellent meats, excellent wines. Of course, like anywhere in France, it's got excellent bread, foie gras, a whole bunch of really fun things. You put it all together, and then you have a big picnic with the food tour group at the end of it. So that was a very fun thing to do, and also a way to try some of their unique foods. And then we had that first day, like I was mentioning before, we always really like taking a walking tour that can kind of orient you to the city. And this one we found someone that essentially was a private guide and historian, Elise, who gives tours there, and I'll send you that information for the show notes. But excellent tour, so much information about art and history and what was scheduled to be, I think maybe it was a 2.5 hour tour. 4 hours later, we were still all walking around together and talking about the city, and just a wonderful experience as a orientation to the city and seeing some of its amazing sights. Probably the most impressive one to see if you're in Toulouse, you have to go see the Basilica of Saint Sernin. It's a huge church. It's looks like a wedding cake, they describe it as, because it goes up in tiers and it's all brick, and it's amazing to think of how tall it is and that it was made out of brick and it's been around that long. It's amazing. So that was a beautiful sight to see. Capitol Square, which is their main, like a Plaza Mayor would be in some place in Spain. We stayed on an Airbnb very near. That was the heart of the city. Every single evening and day, there were people out doing things, events, jugglers, people selling things, kids out there meeting other friends. It was just the heart of the city. And so it's a beautiful square to begin with. And they've got the city hall that is right there on that main square that actually has a beautiful free several floors of artwork that have to do with that region. And so not only is it impressive artwork there, it's absolutely enormous. The panels of the art are huge. They're almost like a billboard size, and there are floors of them there. And so you're also not just seeing art that's impressive, but it's pictures of the city or pictures of things in the region. So it's definitely worth doing. And we stayed on Capitol Square. The only trick is you have to be paying attention because trying to figure out when it's open is almost impossible. We knew we wanted to see it from the very first day that we were there, and we were staying on the square, and we looked every single time we walked out by the square, and we were there for 5 days. And finally, I think maybe in day 4, we finally noticed that it was open and made a beeline to go in there and see it. So if you're there, I would just say pay attention if you happen to pass by it, and if you see it open, stop whatever you're doing and go over and look at it because it may not be 2 hours later. But it was a very interesting, beautiful thing to see. A couple of other highlights maybe in Toulouse as well, because there's so many buildings and museums and sites that you could see. You could easily spend 3, 4, or 5 days like we did just stopping and seeing all the sites. But you have to go to the Garonne River, which is the river that goes through Toulouse, and there's the old bridge that goes across it. And we again happened to be there because we were with Elise, who was really giving us good advice. We ended up there at the end of the day at sunset. Beautiful, the sun's going down. It's sunset over this old bridge crossing this beautiful river with all the architecture in the background. Very magical, very beautiful thing to see there.
Okay, sounds good.
The only other thing that I would mention specifically that I would highly recommend in Toulouse, because again, there's a whole bunch of things that you could go to, all the museums, all of the sites that you could see. They're very easy to find by just looking on their website. But this is the only place that we've ever done this specific kind of a food tour. And I'm a sucker for food tours. I just think they're always fun. But there's a food tour in Toulouse. It's called Toulouse Gourmet Tours. And it's a gentleman who is a chef, and he has a cargo bike. And he has a big box on the back of his cargo bike, and you go along with 10 or so people through a walking tour through the city, and he stops at various sites, and he's picked 7 sites that he thinks are important to the city, and he gives you the what's to know about this particular site. So like a walking tour, very informative, very interesting. But then he'll open up his cargo bike and he'll whip out a special dish that is applicable to that site in some way. And they're not just pre-made, he's making them with a little flamethrower that he's got to cook the toast or to cook the stuff in, or some other way of cooking all of his food. And it was excellent. The food was unbelievable at all of these stops. It was the only time I've really ever gone on a food walking tour where someone is giving you that much history, but they're also whipping up essentially what looked like very good tapas or pinchos at every single stop. And everyone that was walking by kept looking at us like, what is this? And you could see they obviously wanted to come by and maybe have a taste themselves as well. But it was a lot of fun. So it was history and a chance to see some unique foods that they do here. I think anytime you go to these kind of places and you can do a food walking tour, it's almost always fun to do.
And I think you mentioned the tour guide Elise in Toulouse.
Yes.
I think Elise was also a podcaster on the Join Us in France podcast. She doesn't do it full time anymore.
Yes.
But okay.
That's how we found her, and she was excellent and super friendly, and I would highly encourage anybody to do that because it was just an amazing amount of information from somebody who lives there. So that was the interesting thing, especially as an American that lives in that area. And so the questions that we would ask were like, yes, I had similar questions, and here's how that works in France. And so it was a lot of fun to do that.
And Annie from Join Us in France has been on the show on the most recent episode we did on Paris, which is the connection there to Amateur Traveler and to that podcast.
But Toulouse is a wonderful city. As I said at the beginning, it's also a university city, but it's also just a bigger city as well. And so you definitely, I think, could go there almost any time and feel like, unlike some places that sometimes you go to and you don't hit them during tourist season, they can feel like they're shut down or there's no one there because they just shut down after the tourist season. Toulouse, I think you could go there almost any time and always feel like it's very vibrant. There's lots going on. Everything is open.
And this is also the center for France's aerospace industry.
Correct.
This is where Airbus is located, and also some of the Spot satellite system and things like that are also in Toulouse. So it is also a important city in the modern economy as well.
Yeah, and I think, as I mentioned before, if you can get more days into an itinerary, this is at least what we did. On any long trip towards the end, you're getting a little bit, maybe a little less energetic than you were at the beginning of the trip. But it's fun, at least for us sometimes, and we spent 5 days in Toulouse essentially because you can wind down a little bit and just hang out and be a pretend local for a little bit. And
Yep.
it's fun to do that on the end of a trip where you've got some days that you can just meander and hang around, and there's tons of shopping, there's tons of markets that you can go to, there's tons of restaurants. Again, if you're like us when we're traveling, by the end of a trip you're looking for maybe some other types of food, and in a university town there's not a single type of food that you would not find that would be excellent. If you wanted sushi, if you wanted Mexican food, if you wanted hamburgers, pizza, Italian food, it's all there. So it's fun sometimes to be in a big city like that where you can maybe go get some of your old favorites if you're missing some of your home style of foods.
Excellent. And the other historic thing that's interesting with Toulouse is after the breakup of the Western Roman Empire, this was the capital of the Visigoth kingdom, which was here and then down into Spain.
Yeah, and as I said on some of the other places, if you're into the Camino de Santiago, there are lots of places that you can see those markers. Because we had a couple of weeks to be in this region, I took a few days off here and there and hiked certain parts of it. An easy way to do it, if you're trying to do it, at least the way I do it, is if you're in a major city, I just go get in an Uber and pick some random spot outside of the city as far as I think I want to hike that day. If it's 5 hours, if it's 6 hours, if it's 8 hours, if it's 2 hours, you just calculate how long that would be. And I just use all trails on your phone, and the taxi will just drop you off seemingly in the middle of nowhere, exactly where that is, because the map on your phone tells you exactly which way to go, and then you can just hike the Camino back into the center of the city, and then you're just right back to where you started. And we're always staying in the center of the city. And in Toulouse, for instance, I did that one direction and the other. So one day I hiked out as you were coming into the city, another as if you were leaving the city. And it's just a fun way to get a little bit of a taste of that without doing the entirety of it and hiking over the Pyrenees. But from Toulouse, that's where you would keep going. You would just hike up over the Pyrenees, go into Spain, and then you would join the normal Camino Frances. So it's fun if you're into that as well.
Excellent. Anything else before we get to our wrap-up questions that we should know before we head to this particular portion of France?
No, I think hopefully that covered it. And as I said, if someone finds that they've got a little more time, you could certainly expand this schedule. And if you were in other parts of France, this would be a very easy thing to link up with. If you were in Bordeaux, that would be fairly easy to get here. If you were in the French Riviera, it would be very easy to get here. So there's other parts in France that, especially with the TGV high-speed train, which runs into Toulouse, it'd be very easy to get somewhere else in France if you wanted to, and either make this at the beginning or make this at the end of some longer trip to France. It's very easy to get around if you want to add this component to some other trip that somebody might be planning.
Right, exactly. Excellent. As we get to our wrap-up questions, you know what these are. You're standing in the prettiest spot in this whole region. Where are you standing, and what are you looking at?
Yeah, I think I would have to say it's what I was mentioning in Toulouse. So you're standing on the Pont Neuf Bridge, which is the old bridge in Toulouse, looking across the Garonne River at sunset.
No, that's actually the new bridge in Toulouse.
That's true. Yeah, you have to be careful, like the old and the new, and what that really means for us in the U.S. But you're looking across, seeing the sunset. At least for me, you're imagining, because that bridge is where the Camino goes across the river, and so you're imagining all the people that have travel over that bridge over hundreds or thousands of years, and all the people in the city that have gone back and forth, and just hanging out looking at a beautiful sunset with beautiful skyline and architecture behind you. That is probably what I would say was the prettiest place we saw.
Yeah, the new bridge was started construction in the 1500s.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because on the other side of that bridge, there's an old Pilgrim's hospital on the other side of that bridge. Of course, because I'm in the Camino, I'm going to go to every single one of those places, and my wife says, I'll see you later after I go do something different. And so on the other side of that bridge, though, as you could imagine, back in the day, if you were a pilgrim and you were crossing into the city, not surprisingly, you would have a pilgrim hospital, essentially, to take care of all the pilgrims that just barely made it there. But it's interesting because now that old Pilgrim's Hospital is now a very active modern training hospital, because I walked over there and looked at it, and it's just people are going in and out just like it's a regular hospital, and all the names of that particular hospital are all emblazoned on the ambulance but it's fun because you can see the Camino and the shell, but it's actually something that they're using now for real world things that are going on there right now. So it's fun to sit there and imagine pilgrims coming across with their stick, and now people getting help there at the real hospital in the same building 1,000 years later.
Interesting. One thing that makes you laugh, and say only in the Languedoc.
I think I would have to say that it's trying to go read street signs in Toulouse when you're trying to find your way around town. And you're thinking when you look at these street signs that you can figure it out, because you read it and it seems like it's somewhat French, which my wife is going to try to figure out, but it seems like it's a little bit Spanish because I might be trying to figure out what it says. But then finally you figure out from the guides or other people that it's not either, because it's all written in Occitanie, which is a blend of both French and Spanish. And you then say, okay, that's why I couldn't figure it out, because it's neither, but it's both. And so you have to laugh and say, that's only going to happen there because that language is really only used there, and even not really very much. But they have all the street signs in Toulouse, for instance, are both in French and in Occitanie. So you can look at that and try to sound it out, or try to figure out, like, that word seems like something I would recognize in Spanish, but it's not really. So it's funny to do that.
And you mentioned at the beginning that this region was both Occitanie and Languedoc. Languedoc is the historic province, and Occitanie is the larger and current geographical designation of this area here, or the French state, as it were.
Right, which kind of makes sense because that sort of harkens back to that region and how that region got its name to begin with Languedoc being the language of Oc versus the language of Oui, which is how the rest of the France worked out. So it's interesting because there's just so many layers of names that we're not used to in the States. The state that I'm from is Texas, and it hasn't had any other name since it's been in the United States, and I don't think it's going to have a new name. But in there, a region or what we might think of as a county or state has got so many different names. You get confused at the beginning of, well, which one is it called? It's really all the above.
And France got reorganized once or twice into different states, which we don't have.
Right.
And so I know it happened during the time of Napoleon. I don't remember if it happened later on as well, but that's one of the reasons why we sometimes talk about it's this, but it also used to be this sort of thing.
And my guess is that probably in France that there are a lot of people that say, I refuse to call it by that name, and I'm going to call it by this other name. And so therefore all the names live on a little bit because regional differences are reasons that people want to use names, or maybe they don't want to use it because of that.
Interesting. Actually, yes, France reorganized its regions in 2016 with the number of regions reduced from 22 to 13. I guess I missed that memo.
Yeah, we were in the Alsace region last year, and historically, the Alsace-Lorraine area had always had that name. And as you just said, they changed the name to something that doesn't have anything to do with that, and we didn't find a single person in that region that thought that was the right thing to do. They all hated it. But there you go. That's the name.
Grand Est.
Yes.
The Great East.
Yes. They all thought that made no sense, and I'm sure that it went over about the same in this region when they said, we're going to name it something else.
I can imagine in the U.S. if they went into Texas and said, we're going to reorganize you, that might not go over well.
I think it'd be just about as popular.
And if you had to summarize this region in just 3 words, wherever this region may be and whatever its name may be, how would you summarize it?
I would say history, for all the reasons that we've talked about.
Right.
I would say Cathar, because it's got that unique historic flair that can mean a lot of different things and is a very interesting thing to look into. And the third, I'd have to cheat and just say wine and food is both, because it's really got such good cuisine, whether you want to call that wine or food or both, but that would be my third.
We can go with cuisine. That would
cover there you go. That's not cheating that way.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Craig from Dallas. And Craig, thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for the south of France.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Special thanks to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. This is my day job now. I just got off a Zoom call with some of the patrons of the show. I always enjoy that. We do that monthly. If you're a patron of the show, you also get the show a little earlier and without the ads. If you're interested in that, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. New on the Amateur Traveler blog since the last time we talked is an article about my recent trip to Joshua Tree National Park. 1 day in Joshua Tree National Park, a perfect itinerary. So check that out at amateurtraveler.com. By the time this comes out, I'll be heading to New York City for the International Media Marketplace. Let me know if you're in the area and want to grab some coffee. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.